Pleasure to invite Professor Rajan Gurukkal to present. Professor Rajan Gurukkal was Professor Thapar's student, so I think we have many generations from Professor Gurukkal to Professor Devika. So we didn't know that when we planned this. This is a happy coincidence for us. Professor Gurukkal taught later on after studying with Professor Thapar, taught in JNU as her colleague. Sorry, am I mispronouncing it?
Yeah, you said Rajan Gurukkal. Oh yeah, my God.
He then went to Mahatma Gandhi University, and he was the founder director of the School of Social Sciences there. He taught there for over 20 years. Then he moved to the Indian Institute of Science as the Soundarajan chair. Then he moved back to the old university, this time as vice chancellor. That's a nice way to move back. And then he was there for a while, and then he's currently back in the Institute of Science. He's published widely, mostly with Oxford University Press, and his intellectual interest is in the social formations of early South India. So I welcome him to speak. Thank you.
Professor Thapar, Nikhil, distinguished scholars and friends, I am addressed to as Gurukkal in North India and Gurukkal in South India. That was the confusion. Anyway, I am a teacher by caste and would have really run a Gurukula if I had lived the past. I haven't taken any particular work of Professor Thapar for discussion. I have a specific theme that runs across her works, and my focus is on one of the very vital aspects of her studies. I've titled it as Epistemic Encounters in Thapar's Writings. I'll just go through the text. That will save time, and also I will be able to reduce the effect of my muddled thinking, which will certainly increase if I start speaking about it. Romila Thapar has authored an impressive body of scholarly writings distinct for intellectual depth. One of the vital factors in her writings is the aspect of epistemic encounters with the dominant interpretations. I call it an epistemic encounter for the reasons of difference in terms of properties like premises, inferential logic, nature of evidence, and the concept of truth involved in the relationship. It's a relationship of confrontation with the fundamental concepts of the constitution of knowledge. The powerful presence of this feature is central to her studies, starting from the very first major work, Ashoka and the Decline of the Mauryas, which encounters the dominant knowledge that Ashoka was an emperor far beyond his times, a conqueror suddenly converted to Buddhism as a result of the cruelty he had to inflict on Kalinga, a follower of Buddhism propagating Dharma, and so on, as interpreted or maintained by Vincent Smith, Fritz Kern, and many others. Thapar's argument has been that Ashoka was very much a ruler of his times, and his relationship with Buddhism was not that of an overnight conversion after the Kalinga War. Moreover, Buddhism was hardly another religion in those days, and Ashoka's Dharma was not just the Buddha Dharma. Thapar interpreted Ashoka's Dharma, an ideal diplomatic tool of social integration, a political policy of social responsibility. The aspect of encounter becomes sharper in her Sardar Patel Memorial Lectures, published as The Past and Prejudice in 1975. These studies encounter the nature of the knowledge formulated in the Western writings on India. In the process, she unravels the racial, religious, cultural, and communal prejudices embedded in them. In several journal articles that were reprinted subsequently in her ancient Indian social history, some interpretations published in 1978 and Interpreting Early India published in 1992, this exercise gave rise to a critical dimension. This exercise gave a critical dimension to the discussion of the history of history. One is justified in calling it critical historiography that encounters the imperialist predilections of the West. This has been the major issue of sustained encounter in her subsequent writings for several decades. It becomes elaborate and well nuanced in her recent work, The Past Before Us, published in 2013. A long-standing Western allegation that related to the Indian past was the lack of historical sense, widespread dominance of mythical and metaphysical thinking in connection with the past, acceptance of myths and legends as history, and the absence of a linear sense of time were drawbacks alleged in this connection. Thapar's first major encounter of the allegation of absence of a realist sense of time appears in the monograph Time as the Metaphor of History, published in 1996. Other allegations had been about a series of drawbacks of ancient Indian civilization, such as the absence of private property, urbanization, democratic outlook, local self-government, and social change as a major drawback of ancient Indian civilization. Yet another drawback of the past societies of Indian civilization is the absence of dissent, protest, and reform. Nationalist historians had sought to dig out counter-evidences by way of reacting to these allegations. Thapar's writings have responded to those Western Orientalist questions in an altogether different way. She asks, for many decades now, it has been maintained that Indian civilization has shown an absence of dissent and protest. This has become so axiomatic of the Indian past that those who have occasionally questioned it have been labeled as anti-Indian. Such a view stems from a nationalist oversimplification of Indian society as a vision of harmonious social relations in a land of plenty. We have already discussed at length yesterday how the questions against the ancient Indian notions of the time are tackled in her writings. To a certain extent, the alleged changelessness has also been discussed. I am not going into the details again. All that I want to highlight is the relationship of epistemic encounter that is central to her approach as distinguished from what had been of nationalist and colonialist approaches. As regards the latter, to quote Thapar's own words, the nationalist historians concerned themselves with those ideas which were necessary to nationalist polemics. They questioned the individual items of historical interpretation rather than examining the validity of a theory as a total pattern of interpretation. Nor did they attempt to replace the existing theories by new ones, fundamentally different from what had gone before. Thapar says, for many decades now, it has been maintained that Indian civilization has shown an absence of dissent and protest. This has become so axiomatic. I have already quoted it earlier. Thapar's is not just a game theoretical engagement guided and controlled by the meanings, measures, and parameters set by the West, but a strong positioning face to face to revert the allegations to the West itself, as to see whether what it claims have any historical veracity. There is no running around in search of the kind of evidence what the West is demanding, unlike what the nationalist historians did. Instead, there is a thorough scrutiny of the foundation, validity and context of the allegations on the one side, an examination of the historical veracity of the claims of the West about itself. In fact, there are three factors to be noted here. One is the acceptance of certain broad epistemological universals about determining the ways and means of validating knowledge. Second is examination of the historicity of the merits that the West has uncritically attributed to itself in the light of these universals. Third is scientific analysis of the alleged features against their context and explanation of what they meant and how they worked in their context. The process involves a rebuttal of the West's claim of its features as the universally ordained normative. Her writings on historiography explain how some of the historical perceptions have influenced the writing of early interpretation of ancient Indian history, how the colonial comprehension of early and contemporary India influenced the ideas of Durkheim and Weber in relation to pre-colonial India, and how various perspectives influenced the representational mode of Indian history. Thapar's encounter is not confined to Western prejudices alone. It is directed against the nationalist and revivalist romanticizing of the past too. Historical explanation of social processes, institutional origins, and formation of ideas being her central preoccupation, she keeps herself up to date in social theory. Thapar has persistently rejected the historically unfounded notions of tradition and despised the attempts at discovering simple continuities in history. She has been successfully explaining the historical context of traditions, the changing nature and functions of rites and rituals, the structure and composition of orally transmitted texts, the dialectics between cultural heterogeneity and homogeneity, and the interconnectedness of cultural practices and social power relations. What has been significantly different in Thapar's approach is her insistence upon social theory and generation of new knowledge about the society and economy of early India as ferreted out from seemingly unlikely sources by using a very rigorous analysis of the text and all theoretical insights available. Her monograph, Exile and the Kingdom, Some Thoughts on the Ramayana, published in 1978, is a good example of textual analysis based on formalism and structural analysis. Thapar's essay, The Historian and the Epic, points out the fact that the epic is essentially a literary crystallization of the heroic ideal, and therefore it is not to be taken as factual evidence but as the representation of an ideal. In fact, epic age is a misnomer, since epics added to at various times, embodying elements of internal contradictions, giving them a compendium-like quality and disabling them to present a homogeneous society in time and space. Thapar says, epic literature emerges out of heroic ages and often retains the flavor of such an age in spite of repeated redactions of the text and the interpolation of later ages. The epic can be seen as the expression of a certain historical consciousness, even though the events which it describes may not be historically authenticated. So attempting to derive chronological information and to characterize the nature of societies from the epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, makes little sense. To the votaries of Hindutva who urge to replace professional history with epics, she asked to specify which of their versions have to be read as history. These issues are either ignored or forgotten by historians who use the epics as a source material. Thapar hardly means a de facto rejection of the value of epics as a source material. Her essays such as Some Aspects of the Economic Data in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana Theme and Variation, in their eminence of analytic rigor demonstrate how what the epics depict is very useful to historical reconstruction. Similarly, some of her essays about the renouncer in a social context further illustrate how text should be used for doing history. Discussion of certain aspects of the social change at the instance of Upanishads by focusing on the initial historical process that enabled the doctrine of the immortality of the soul and the later ideology signifying a lack of it for the dominant social group is a good example. A clarification that I would like to seek here is how such ideological factors become a driving force for social change. Her studies about the social authority and power of the renouncer, unusual and paradoxical aspects of Indian religion are very powerful demonstrations of her alternative methodology. Thapar explains how in the early period the renouncer emerges with the coming of sects such as the Buddhists and the Jains, which in turn are tied to some of the departures from Vedic ritual as registered in the major Upanishads. Keeping in view of the social authority that a renouncer attains and the centrality of the individual implied here, she interprets the cult of renunciation as the assertion of the individual in the social context. An essay on the householder and the denouncer in the Brahmanical and Buddhist traditions, which shows that the ashrama theory may have been of an idealist abstraction, projecting an ordering of the ideal life cycle for the Dvija and particularly for the Brahmana, is another example for her alternative methodology of using the text. The widespread denial that early India can provide evidence of a sense of history, a question so entrenched now that one almost hesitates to deny, has been provoking Thapar for epistemic encounters over the last 60 years. She marked the beginnings of a fundamental shift in the perspective of the 1960s, suggesting that it might be feasible to search for history in early India. A systematic inquiry in this direction was set in by her by a proper distinction between how the past is to be understood and represented and a perception of the past as specifically historical. She does a whole book of rare insights to argue the past, argue for a denial of history. Her arguments start with the denial of the relevance of the question of historical sense itself in the light of the fact that every society has a concept of the past and that no society is ahistorical and that every society sees its past in a particular way, which it may refer to as history or not, but which is relevant to understanding that society. According to Thapar, many texts of early India reflect a consciousness of the past, and they show how over a period of time there came into existence varieties of texts with recognizable forms of history and historical writing. Thapar begins her encounter by proving that the widely accepted colonial presumption that one cannot locate in early India the sense of history comparable to the Greco-Roman historical texts, the Chinese chronicles, the Arab writings, or even the biblical genealogies. She exposes this distinction hollow by showing how the classical Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, Renaissance European and Islamic traditions of history were all of diverse strands and a mixture of history and fiction. Quoting authorities like Paul Vane, Collingwood, and Momigliano, Thapar points out that nobody can establish Thucydides, a source-based factual historian, that the ancient Greeks had not differentiated between primary and secondary sources, that there were no historians in the sense that there were artists and philosophers, and that Polybius and other Roman historians were concerned with rhetorical preoccupations and political motives. Thapar then examines the constitution of colonial formulation about early India, dismissing histories in the Sanskrit tradition as historical. She goes into how the West constituted its knowledge about India on the basis of the accounts of the Mediterranean travelers, geographers, and invaders, and propagated ideas such as changelessness and absence of historical sense. How it strengthened the utilitarian prejudices and led to the formulation of the communal thesis of James Mill and the construction of the concept of Asiatic society that even Karl Marx was unable to escape. What Thapar's encounter does is an epistemological critique of the Western historiographical preeminence by reading European historiography against itself and uniting the opposites between the West and the East by discovering the correspondence in the historiographies of the two, whereby exposing for the first time the self-contradiction implicit in the Western denial of historical sense in early India. It overturns and surpasses the imposing narrative structure of the Western historiography and its normative, the universality of which she refuses to accept for theoretical reasons. In the sense that the history of every age has been a representation of contemporary consciousness, she asks, how come that the colonial European sense of history, which was contemporary consciousness too, could set the universal normative? Then Thapar comes to the analysis of Indian texts with an introduction to the nuanced differentiation among historical consciousness, historical tradition, and historical writing. We have already discussed at length these aspects, certainly pertaining to her magnum opus. Yeah. So I'm skipping that. 5 minutes or 10 minutes? 5 minutes. Unlike what most historians do, Thapar reads ancient texts not for the information they provide about person and event. Instead, she reads them from the specific focus of how they represent past societies and the actions of persons believed to have been historical. Her project is to try and understand the way the past text was looking at its own past. Thapar's interpretation of what texts seek to accomplish depends on her close understanding of the way the text relies on the prior text. In short, it practically goes about constituting what is called intertextuality, that is the relationship among texts which forms a domain in which the text makes epistemic sense. It's a detailed probing into ambiguities, ironies, contradictions, conflicts, silences, breaks, deviations, differential meanings, linguistic oddities, recurrences, and so on in early Indian texts. She pays incredibly intense attention to the language of the text and painstakingly examines the ways a text implies something different from what it openly states. Her strategy is to look for moments in each text which it refers to itself and to discover as to how the texts unravel themselves. Thapar's epistemic encounter has a politics of knowledge, self-consciously realist. This is explicit in her analysis of the present in the past, and they are concerned about the way in which Indian history has been interpreted during the colonial period to encourage communal views of the past. She says, the evolution of Hinduism is not a linear progression from a founder through an organizational system with the sects branching off. It is rather the mosaic of distinct cults, deities, sects and ideas, and the adjusting, juxtaposing or distancing of these existing ones, the placement drawing not only on belief and ideas but also on the socio-economic reality. We have discussed yesterday a powerful historiographical critique of the political appropriations of the theory of Aryan race. To wind up, the aspect of epistemic encounter in Thapar's writings informs us that doing history by sketching only what is obvious in the sources needs no historian, and a historian's professional task is distinct for its intellectual depth. She is certain that inquiries into the history of historical sense should begin with textual representations of the past instead of with the past itself. Likewise, the inquirer should know that there exists no textual model as of now that can accurately represent the past. To what extent is a textual model adequate for historical representation is, therefore, not the question she addresses, but what implications can we draw from each text is her object. It would mean that no historical text ever embodied truth about the past, but only the truth that each text constructed as its time wanted. The past and the written history are not the same anyway, a predicament that precludes the possibility of the latter to be strictly hypothetico-deductive or objective. Hence, Thapar makes no claims for logocentric certainties and methodological objectivity in her works, for she is convinced that such claims are not philosophically sustainable. And all that I incessantly draw from her works is a lesson how to unlearn one's learning. Thank
you. It's impossibly difficult for me to comment on this survey of virtually everything I've written. Let me take up one theme of what he said, which also came up yesterday and this morning. The historian's use of social theory, which I think is very important to much of the historical writing that has been done in the last 50 years, certainly in some cases before that even. We all began and we were trained initially to search for more and more information on a particular subject. And in a sense that also conditioned the way in which we looked at texts. This is the question that was raised by Sundar this morning, as to why there is no critical inquiry. There is no critical inquiry in ancient Indian history, or there was no critical inquiry, because of the training that one received, that your business is to go through a text and gather information. And so when I decided that I would do some work, do a PhD on Ashoka, if I may bring in a little autobiographical element here, when I proposed this to the body of historians at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, where I did my PhD, they all groaned and said, "Not another study of Ashoka. So much has been done already. Do you have anything new to say?" And I said, "I don't know if I have anything new to say, but what I would like to do is to place him in historical context and then see what emerges." And so they agreed and said, "Well, you think it out and try and do a little preliminary work, on condition that if you find that you can't place him in historical context to your satisfaction, that you will give up this theme and work on something else." The fact that I proceeded with the PhD and did something else, and didn't do something else, meant that I did feel that I had perhaps discovered some way of placing him in historical context. Very little had actually been said about him as a person. Most of the studies had been studies from the point of view of Buddhism. What was he propagating as a good Buddhist? Incidentally, I'm using this example of my thesis to try and demonstrate the way in which I began and how social theory eventually entered much more of my writing than at the beginning. That was a time in the middle 50s when, of course, there was a lot of discussion going on about Marxism. And so we were all, in a sense, looking for the possibility of, is there a Marxist way of answering the questions that we were asking? And so one of my questions was, is a Marxist perspective useful to me? And I thought, well, yes, certainly in the study of the social and economic background of that time, perhaps even for the administration of the empire, it would be a useful exercise to try and see it to some degree in Marxist terms. My problem, of course, was that, like much of my entry into social theory, I didn't spend months and months on reading the original sources of the thinkers I was using. I cheated, and I would often use texts that had either used the theory and see how it was used, or I would use texts that explained the theory without necessarily going back and reading the originals. Though in some cases it did become very necessary to read the originals if I was going to take a position either in support or in opposition. So it's not absolutely correct to say that I cheated completely, but I tried to cheat as much as I could, but was prevented from doing so. There were very few actually analytical explanations of the edicts. And I began by saying that I'm going to look at what this man actually writes and how he expresses himself. I'm not going to look at all the other texts for the moment. I will simply look at this body of texts. And so I started studying the edicts very, very meticulously and discovered that there were two categories of edicts. One was the set of edicts addressed to the general public, in which he says that he expects people to behave in accordance with the Dharma. He defines the Dharma, and he defines it in terms very much of social ethics. And I was very struck by the fact that he nowhere mentions the name of the Buddha. It's true that a lot of the people at that time understood by Dharma the teachings of the Buddha, and yet he is quite specific in his discussion of Dharma as being social ethics. And there's another set of edicts, smaller in number, very specific, addressed to the monasteries which were the major centers of Buddhism at that time, in which he speaks as a Buddhist very firmly and says that these are the texts that you should read, and those who are dissenters should be thrown out of the monastery, dressed in white clothes, not in ochre robes, and thrown out of the monastery. And I found this very puzzling as to why he would make this distinction, until I began to feel that really what one was addressing in looking at these edicts was Ashoka, the man, the person who was, by all accounts, a Buddhist, or very close to being so, and Ashoka the statesman, the ruler, who had other issues to contend with, and therefore his use of the Dhamma was for reasons other than only propagating a particular kind of idea of behavior. It was in order to also bring together and instill in people the kind of social ethics that I presumed he thought were important for ruling such a diverse empire. So in a sense that was the beginning, and I then went on and started looking at the context. And for the context, of course, I read the statements of the Greek Megasthenes, and I read the Arthashastra, and then also for the context and for him personally, I read the Buddhist accounts in the Mahavamsa and the Deepavamsa from Sri Lanka. And then there were, of course, all the archaeological excavations that had been carried out, which gives us an idea of what the background was. Now, I had a choice of either treating this in strictly Marxist terms as base and superstructure, or I had a choice of treating it much more flexibly as this is the historical context, and here is a person who is trying out different ways in which to handle this context, who is gradually narrowing down his concerns with the context and gradually working out a way of doing it, which is not really, strictly speaking, going according to base and superstructure, but is somewhat influenced by the idea that the context can sometimes give you a clue to the kind of ideology that a person is propagating. And that was the point when I had completed the thesis, before I wrote it up, when I started looking at other social theories, because it was this kind of questioning that led me to realize that history was not simply information, that history was explanation and understanding, and if one was going to explain and understand the past, one had to see it in a multi-dimensional way, and not just from even the reign and the actions of one particular person. And this stayed with me in my later work. That is, the constant need to ask, this is a question that I am posing to my evidence. Have other people asked these questions? By other people, I didn't mean just historians, but social scientists as well. Have other people asked these questions? And if other people have asked these questions, I should be reading about what they have asked, what kinds of answers that they found. So, for example, to jump to another bit of writing, my book on lineage to state, which was very much a book that was influenced by historical thinking at that time, as it had continued from the thesis right up to the time I joined JNU, and which was also influenced by what Rajan was referring to, my interest in social theory. And how did this come about? Largely, I think, through two things. One was that I took archaeology rather more seriously, I think, than most of my contemporaries did, contemporary historians did, and had long conversations with archaeologists, and also when I couldn't read the archaeological reports, which sounded very technical to me, I remember going to Mr. V.K. Thapar, who was then with the Archaeological Survey, and saying, how do I understand these reports? And he said, only one way, you come and excavate. So I undertook a period of excavation and excavated with the ASI at Kalibangan. And after 3 seasons of excavating, I came out looking much more rugged than when I had gone in, because it's a rough area to dig in, but understanding archaeological reports. And when I say understanding archaeological reports, what I mean is understanding the way in which historians should use archaeological evidence. Again, the way in which it had been done before was to say, well, here's an excavation, this is the report, this is the kind of pottery that was found, these were the other artifacts that were found, and these are the layers in which they were found, and there's your information. But at that point, one started asking other kinds of questions, like, what was the function of this pottery? How much of it was ritual pottery? How much of it was functional pottery? What was the function of these objects that were found? What was the nature of the settlement? And this becomes very important when you're looking at places, not just the excavations at Pataliputra, which were very difficult because the city is now occupied, but other excavations of that period, where this whole transition from village to town, and from town to exchange center to trade, becomes a very major issue. And this then filled in the gaps as far as commercial enterprise was concerned. Archaeology was one. The other thing that influenced me enormously was social anthropology, because I began to realize that the kinds of societies that we were dealing with in ancient periods possibly had some similarities or some parallels. Please note, I'm saying this with much emphasis, not imitating, not identical, but there might have been some similarities and parallels with the early societies, with the kinds of societies that social anthropologists were discussing and were commenting on. And this was a time when my reading in social anthropology was partly conditioned by some fairly frequent visits to Paris, where I met a number of interesting anthropologists. Maurice Godelier, for example, who was very hot on kinship. And it was through discussions with him and through reading his writing that I began to look a little differently at the problems of kinship as demonstrated, for example, in the epics. Why is kinship so important? Both the epics and in the Buddhist texts that speak of the Ganasanghas. And this was what began to convince me that what you really had was a society based on kinship in terms of clan relationships rather than the emphasis being given to caste. Caste was there, but it was of a different nature from clan, and so you had these kinds of dual stratifications going on. And then I also read much of another anthropologist called Emmanuel Terray, who wrote on very early societies, and from whom I picked up a few of the questions that I began to ask of the early literature that I was looking at. Let me insist again that the idea was not to apply directly. That was not that you picked up these questions and answers and applied them directly, and that was the solution to the problem. But you use them as indicators of the kinds of questions that you might consider working out for your own texts. And this is a very major difference, and it's a very important difference. We do not merely pick up questions from other disciplines and their answers and say, oh, this helps us answer the question in history. You pick up the nature of the questions and you formulate your own questions when you approach the sources for the study of ancient history. So one of the ways in which this was done was, and this was also not all pure anthropology, by the way, it was also a time when I got quite interested in the study of Greek history as a comparative study. And of course, this is the time when you had the great historians, people like Moses Finley, writing precisely on the Greek epics and on early Greek society and so on. And again, I found it very interesting to read them as comparative studies. In other words, what was going on there, and how did that compare with what was going on in India? Not at comparable periods of time necessarily, but in similar kinds of societies, and therefore that was another dimension to all of this. How actually one used the questions of social anthropology, I can explain that with one case. I read Marcel Mauss, The Gift, where he discusses the notion of how gift giving has many dimensions. It's not just A giving a gift to B, but it has the dimensions of an economic exchange, social status being established, and the status between the gift giver and the gift receiver, and the function and purpose of giving the gift. These were questions that we had never asked before. Umpteen historians have written about Dan and Dakshina and have given the information on occasions when such exchanges took place, but it never went beyond. And I decided that I would use these ideas that Mauss had worked out in his book on gift exchange and apply them to the notion of dharana and dakshina and see what emerges. And I did a little essay on the subject, which was then picked up by one or two historians who worked on it. Anyway, a lot of this, and amongst the Indian historians, I suppose one can call him a historian, who were writing on this, I found the writing of D.D. Kosambi the most compulsive in the sense of the kinds of questions he raised. And I was constantly asking myself, is this a legitimate question? How would I raise it? Would I raise it in the same way? And also the kinds of answers he provided. I found that the most impressive of the Marxist writings on ancient Indian history. And consequently, again, I was using it as a kind of sounding board for the questions that I wanted to ask. All of this comes together in a way from lineage to state, and that is one reason perhaps why the Marxist historians of ancient India referred to it as more anthropology than Marxism. Which is fair enough. I think that, by then, my understanding of Marxism also went in various different ways. What was I concerned with in asking these questions? I was concerned with getting more precise answers, and I thought perhaps these questions would give me more precise answers. I was also very excited by the thought that, social sciences could be integrated in the study of a particular problem. Not just the study of a historical problem, but even the other social sciences, any social science, if it was to take up the issue from a historical point of view, would probably benefit by the information that it received from doing so. And so, let me then conclude by saying that my interest in social theory was not to argue about theorization. It was not to take up positions where the entire argument was in the abstract about theorization, the theories that existed and what theories could be used and what should not be used and so on. My argument arose very much from the fact that you have to have a body of information on the basis of which you try out social theories, and then you pull out the ones that make the maximum sense to you. In other words, I had a lot of the, what people today call, when they describe me, I had a lot of the positive empiricist in me still hanging on as the foundation on which I would then build something of a social theory.